The fog had already come in by the time I poured my first cup of coffee that Tuesday morning. Not the heavy kind that swallows the harbor whole, just a low, quiet gray that softened the edges of everything, the way Briar Hollow tends to do if you let it. I stood on my porch and listened to the channel marker bell somewhere out past the breakwater, counting its rhythm like a pulse. 3 years I'd been doing this. 3 years since I left Hartford, left the office, left the house that still smelled like her, even after I'd repainted every room. Briar Hollow wasn't a plan. It was a surrender. And most mornings, standing there with that salt air filling my chest, it felt like the right one. I walked into town around 9. The diving bell sat at the end of Wharf Street, wedged between a bait shop and a shuttered ice cream stand, its windows so cluttered with hanging brass instruments and sun-bleached charts you could barely see inside. The bell above the door gave its little tin cough when I pushed through, and there was Opal, perched on her stool behind the counter like a sea captain holding court. White hair pinned up with what I'm fairly sure was a chopstick, reading glasses dangling on a beaded chain. "Glenn Harwick," she said, the way she always said it, like my name was an old joke she still found funny. "Kettle's already on." That was our routine. Had been for 2 years. I'd sit in the cracked leather chair by the porthole window. She'd bring me a cup of her chamomile, which frankly tasted like someone had boiled a meadow, and she'd talk about tides, about the migratory patterns of Atlantic puffins, about the logging industry's effect on coastal erosion, and about the Amity Crest. Always the Amity Crest. A 3-masted schooner, she'd tell me, lost in a November storm in 1887, carrying a payroll of gold coins meant for a logging camp up the Penobscot. Opal had binders full of her own research, hand-drawn maps, photocopied harbor records, bathymetric sketches she'd done herself back when she still dove. Most folks in town smiled and nodded when she brought it up. Charming old Opal and her ghost ship. I smiled and nodded too. But I also listened. There's a difference. That morning, though, she didn't sit down. She came around the counter fast, teacup forgotten, and pressed something into my palm. Cold, heavy for its size. A brass key, maybe 3 inches long, crusted with green oxidation, so thick it looked like it was growing fur. "Tidal pool," she said, "below the south ledge, yesterday afternoon." I turned it over. The bow of the key had a shape to it, looked like it might have been decorative once, before the sea had its way with it. "Opal," I said gently, "don't." She held up a finger. Her eyes had something in them I hadn't seen before. Not her usual bright enthusiasm, but something sharper, urgent. "This came from somewhere close, Glenn. Not deep water. Close." That changes everything about the drift pattern. I handed the key back, told her it was a fine piece, told her she should document where she found it. She took it with both hands, almost reverently, and I drank my tea and we talked about the weather turning, and I walked home. 2 days later, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. I knew before I answered. You don't get calls at 6 a.m. in a town of 412 people for good news. "Glenn, it's Patty." The constable's voice was flat, controlled, the way people sound when they've already said a hard thing once and are steeling themselves to say it again. "Opal Thistledown passed away last night. She fell down those back stairs behind the shop. Eddie Malcolm found her this morning when he came to deliver firewood." I sat on the edge of my bed. I didn't say anything for a while. "Those stairs," Patty said, filling the silence. "You know how they get with the moss. We've all told her." "Yeah," I said. "I'm sorry, Glenn. I know you two were close." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat there in the gray light of my bedroom and listened to the channel marker bell, and I breathed and I thought about a woman holding a green-crusted key in both hands like it was something holy. The stairs were slippery. Everybody knew that. Opal was 72, and she was stubborn about not using the handrail, and it had been damp all week. It made sense. It all made perfect sense. And still, something sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't cough up. Not a thought exactly. Not yet. Just a weight. The kind I used to feel 20 years ago, sitting across a desk from someone whose story checked out on paper, but left the air in the room wrong. I couldn't name it. but I couldn't put it down either. Saturday morning, I put on the dark suit I hadn't touched since Hartford. It still smelled faintly of cedar and someone else's life. I knotted the tie twice before I got it right, my fingers thick and clumsy, and I walked the half-mile to the whitewashed chapel on the bluff, where the bells were already ringing out over the harbor in that slow, heavy way that tells a whole town to stop what it's doing. Nearly all of Briar Hollow came. They filled the pews and lined the back wall and spilled out onto the gravel path where the wind carried the minister's words in broken pieces. Wildflowers, lupine and sea lavender, lay across the simple pine casket, and when the congregation tried the second hymn, most of us only hummed, fumbling through verses none of us had memorized. My own voice cracked somewhere around the second line, and I just let it go. But even while I stood there with that ache sitting heavy behind my sternum, the old machinery was turning. I couldn't help it. There's a difference between grief and attendance, and I'd spent too many years reading rooms to stop now. Dale Morrow sat in the fourth pew, left side, his Italian leather shoes glossy against the chapel's scuffed pine floor. He owned half the waterfront lots south of the marina, and I'd heard he had his eye on the rest. His face held the right shape of solemnity, but his eyes were already somewhere else, appraising, calculating square footage even in a house of God. Sylvie Chen, the young librarian who'd spent months helping Opal dig through maritime records, sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes bone dry. Maybe some people grieve that way. Maybe. And then there was Harlan Briggs, Opal's nephew. Nobody in town had ever laid eyes on him before that morning. He'd driven down from Portland, 2 hours, maybe less. But he hadn't come Thursday when she died, hadn't come Friday when the word went out. He came Saturday for the service, and I watched him check his phone during the hymn the rest of us couldn't sing. I filed all three of them away and said nothing. After the service, I walked down toward the harbor, not meaning to pass the diving bell, but my feet knew the route too well. I almost kept going. Almost. But the door was ajar, just an inch, maybe two, and the brass ship's bell Opal kept mounted above the frame, swayed slightly in the draft. I pushed the door open. The shop still smelled like her. Chamomile and old rope, and the faint brine of a life lived near the water. Everything else looked undisturbed. The wooden display cases, the coils of salvage line, the framed daguerreotype of the Briar Hollow waterfront circa 1890. But then I looked at the back wall. The corkboard was bare. Every push pin still in place. Dozens of them, a constellation of colored heads marking where hand-drawn maps and harbor records and bathymetric sketches had hung for years. All of it, gone. Carefully removed, each piece unpinned and taken, the pins pressed back in like whoever did this wanted the board to look untouched at a glance. My eyes dropped to the small glass display case on the counter where Opal kept her prize finds. I'd handed the brass key back to her on Tuesday, watched her set it on the velvet lining inside that case with the kind of reverence most people reserve for holy relics. The case was empty, something locked into place behind my ribs. Not grief anymore, but the cold, clean click of certainty. This wasn't a bereaved nephew collecting mementos. This was somebody who knew exactly what Opal had and came to take it. That evening, I knocked on Constable Patty's door. She answered in a flannel shirt and reading glasses, a mug of something steaming in her hand. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a long time. "I locked that front door myself Thursday afternoon," she said, "after Eddie found her. Haven't been back since. Someone found another way in." She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Glenn, I treated this as an accident because everything pointed that way. Those stairs, the moss, her stubbornness about the handrail. I know. But stripped walls and a missing key don't square with a 72-year-old woman losing her footing." "No," I said, "they don't." She looked at me, really looked, the way people do when they're deciding how much trouble they're willing to invite. "You still have the instincts for this kind of thing?" "I guess we're about to find out." She nodded once. "Poke around, quietly. You find something solid, you bring it to me first." I walked home along the dark harbor road with the salt wind against my face, turning over what I knew and what I didn't. Whoever cleared that wall had worked patiently, methodically. They now possessed everything Opal had spent a lifetime assembling. And I couldn't know yet, whether Opal had told anyone else about pressing that green, oxidized key into my palm on Tuesday morning, which meant I didn't know if whoever took it all knew about me. That was the thought that kept me. Sunday morning, I knelt on the fifth step and the years fell away. I hadn't crouched over evidence since Hartford, hadn't felt the familiar ache in my knees, the way the world narrows to a patch of surface no bigger than a dinner plate. But there I was, fingers brushing damp wood behind the diving bell, the harbor wind cutting through my jacket, and my body remembered everything my mind had tried to forget. The lower steps were slick with moss, sure, green and treacherous, just like Patty's report said. But the fifth step, the one where Opal supposedly lost her footing, told a different story. Two faint scrape marks ran laterally across the grain, right to left, as though a heel had been dragged sideways. Not the forward skid of a slip, a wrench, a twist. The kind of mark a shoe makes when someone's standing behind you and your weight goes somewhere you didn't choose. I photographed them. 3 angles, close-up, wide shot with the railing and frame. Then I stood, steadied myself against the banister, and stared down those stairs the way Opal must have stared down them last. "Bring anything solid to me first," Patty had said. I intended to. Monday, I walked into the Briar Hollow Library 20 minutes after it opened. Sylvie was shelving returns in the back, and when I came around the stack, she flinched. Actually, flinched, before smoothing it into a polite smile. Her eyes flicked past me to the front entrance, then back. "I wanted to ask you about the work you did with Opal," I said. She set down a book, picked it up again, set it down. "We were close to something," she said quietly. The week before." Her jaw tightened. "We cross-referenced the old harbor master logs with geological survey maps from the 60s. There's an underwater rock formation about a quarter-mile past the breakwater. Basalt shelf, drops off sharp. That's where the Amity crest went down. We were almost certain. Do you still have any of that research?" "Copies on my laptop. Opal kept the originals on her board at the shop." I didn't tell her the board was bare. I just nodded. Then she said something that changed the temperature of the room. "Dale Morrow came in here about 2 weeks ago. Asked me about maritime salvage law, who owns an unclaimed wreck in Maine waters, what the filing process looks like." She paused. "He didn't mention Opal by name, but he didn't have to." I thanked her. I didn't linger. Tuesday, I found Harlan Briggs at the Briar Hollow Inn, sitting alone in the small breakfast room, tearing a paper napkin into careful strips. He didn't look up right away when I sat down across from him. "I'm Glenn. I was a friend of your aunt's." "I know who you are." Still not looking up. "She mentioned you." "When?" "Wednesday night. She called me." He finally raised his eyes. They were red-rimmed but dry. "She was excited, almost giddy, which, if you knew Opal, you know that wasn't her speed. She said she'd found it." "Found what?" "Her exact words." He tore another strip. "I found the door the key opens." The room went very still. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind the front desk. "She asked me to come down," Harlan continued. "So I drove. But I didn't get here until Thursday afternoon. Checked in, and the woman at the desk told me about the accident." I watched his face. Thursday afternoon. But nobody in Briar Hollow had seen Harlan Briggs until he walked into that chapel on Saturday. 2 days unaccounted for, in a town where a stranger stands out like a signal fire. I didn't push it. Not yet. I walked back along the harbor road with 3 new threads pulling tight in my hands. Scrape marks on a staircase, a shipwreck pinpointed on a dead woman's maps, and the last words Opal ever spoke to family. I found the door the key opens. She'd been so close. Close enough that someone decided she was too close. And somewhere in this town, someone had that brass key now. Someone who could do with it whatever Opal never got the chance to. I picked up my pace. The fog was coming in, and I had work to do. Wednesday morning. The fog sat heavy on the harbor, pressing against the diner window like it wanted in. I wrapped both hands around my mug and watched the fishing boats materialize and disappear in the gray. And I let my mind do what it always did when I stopped trying to force it. I let it drift back to Opal's voice, filtered through Harlan's memory. "I found the door the key opens. I'd been treating it as metaphor, a breakthrough, a figurative door. But Opal was a cartographer at heart, a woman who dealt in coordinates and compass bearings and physical things you could touch. What if she meant exactly what she said? I left $2 on the counter and drove back to the diving bell. Patty had given me standing permission after Sunday's visit to the stairs, so the bartender just nodded when I came through. The back room was the same as before, low ceiling, salt-warped paneling, that smell of old rope and damp wood that never really leaves a building this close to the water. But this time, I wasn't looking at the stairs. I was looking at the walls. I started with the far corner where a tall shelf of nautical almanacs leaned against the paneling like it had been there since the building was framed. I pulled the first stack down. Dust rolled off the spines in a slow curtain. Behind the second row, my knuckles brushed something that wasn't wall, a seam, vertical, then horizontal. I cleared the rest of the shelf, and there it was, a small closet door, maybe 3 feet tall, painted the same tobacco brown as the surrounding panels. You'd walk past it 1,000 times and never see it. The door was unlocked, slightly open. That detail settled in my chest like a stone, because it meant one of two things. Either Opal left it that way, or someone else had already been here and hadn't found what they were looking for. I crouched and pulled it open. The space behind was barely wider than my shoulders. A single item sat on the rough plank floor. A waterproof leather satchel, the kind you'd use on a research vessel. I reached in and lifted it out. It was light, almost nothing to it. Inside, I found two things. The first was a hand-drawn map. Opal's work, unmistakably, rendered in her precise drafting hand. The basalt shelf past the breakwater, depth soundings penciled in the margins, and a circled point marked Amity Crest. Final position. This was the real map, the finished one. Everything on that stripped corkboard at her shop had been preliminary. This was what she'd been protecting. The second was a letter, handwritten on cream stationery, addressed to Sylvie. I sat down on the floor of that narrow closet. I don't know why. My knees just decided for me. And I read a dead woman's words in her own slanted hand. She'd left the map and all discovery rights to Sylvie. Spelled it out plainly, dated and signed, as binding as she could make it without a lawyer. But it was the second page that stopped my breathing. Opal described running into Dale Morrow at the post office on the Monday before she died. 2 days before the end. She'd mentioned her breakthrough, not the specifics, just that she'd finally pinpointed the wreck. Dale's reaction, in her words, he went very still, then talked too fast. Said we should partner up, said he could bring investors. I told him no. He gripped my arm when I turned to leave. Not hard, but he didn't let go right away. I have felt uneasy since. I read that passage 3 times. Then I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the satchel, and took photographs of everything. The closet, the satchel's position, both pages of the letter, the map, with my phone. Old habits. Chain of custody might not be my responsibility anymore, but it was going to be someone's. I thought about Dale Morrow gripping a 70-year-old woman's arm in the post office. I thought about those lateral scrape marks on the 5th step, and I felt something tighten behind my ribs that I hadn't felt in years. The slow, controlled heat of a case that was about to turn. But I'd made Patty a promise. Evidence comes to her first. I sealed the satchel, tucked it under my arm, and pulled the closet door shut behind me. Somewhere in Briar Hollow, Dale Morrow was going about his Wednesday like a free man. I intended to make sure he enjoyed it, because I didn't think he had many of those left. The next morning, Thursday, I was standing on Margaret Poole's porch at the Briar Hollow Inn before she'd even turned the sign from closed to open. Margaret was 80 if she was a day, hands knotted with arthritis, a woman who smelled like lavender soap and kept a guest book with handwritten entries because she didn't trust computers. She remembered me from a previous visit, held the door wide without asking why I'd come. I told her I was looking into what happened to Opal, and her face changed. Not surprise, relief. The relief of someone who'd been holding a stone in her mouth for a week, waiting for someone to ask her to spit it out. She brought me to the front desk and opened the guest book, turning yellowed pages with trembling fingers until she found the week in question. Harlan Briggs had checked in Thursday afternoon, the day after Opal died. That tracked with everything I already knew. He wasn't in town that Wednesday night. His alibi was clean. But then Margaret tapped another entry with her knuckle. Dale Morrow. Not a guest. He'd been at the inn's small bar that Wednesday evening. She remembered because he'd been nursing the same whiskey for an hour. Quiet, which wasn't like him. Then his phone rang. She watched him answer, watched his face go tight, and watched him leave without closing his tab. Around 9 o'clock. Visibly agitated, she said, like a man who'd just been told something he didn't want to hear. I thanked her. I think she knew what it meant. Patty had a key to the harbor master's office. She'd been the town's part-time constable going on 11 years. A role most people forgot about because Briar Hollow rarely gave her cause to use it. But she had the badge, she had the authority, and when I told her what Margaret said, she had the key in her hand before I finished the sentence. The harbor master's security camera was the only one in town, a single wide-angle lens pointed at the harbor road, recording on a loop that overwrote every 10 days. We were right at the edge of losing it. Patty pulled up Wednesday night's footage on a monitor no bigger than a dinner plate. We watched in silence. Boats rocking, fog rolling, empty road. Then, 9:47 p.m., time stamped in the corner. Dale Morrow's red pickup slid across the frame heading south toward the lane that led to the diving bell's rear staircase. I felt my hands go white against the edge of that desk. Patty drew a breath beside me. Neither of us spoke. At 10:22 p.m., the truck came back, headed north, moving faster. 35 minutes. Whatever happened to Opal, it lived inside that 35 minutes. Friday, 9 a.m. Dale's office above the marine supply store smelled like cheap coffee and old carpet. He was behind his desk when we walked in, and I watched his eyes move from me to Patty's badge and back again. I started with the post office, told him we knew about the Monday he ran into Opal, the conversation about the wreck, the partnership she refused, his hand on her arm. He shrugged. Said it was friendly. Said he was enthusiastic, that's all. Then I told him about the truck, the camera, 9:47 going south, 10:22 coming back. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then I asked him about the corkboard, the one in Opal's shop stripped bare, the preliminary work left behind, the finished map gone. I told him I'd found where she'd hidden it. I told him I'd seen her letter, in her own handwriting, describing exactly how he'd grabbed her and exactly how afraid she'd been. Dale Morrow put his face in his hands. It came out in pieces. He said he went to her shop that night to convince her one more time. He said they argued on the rear staircase. He grabbed her arm, the same arm, I thought, and she pulled away. His voice went small, almost a whisper. She pulled away, and she fell. The room held that silence like a living thing. He said he panicked, went inside, tore everything off the corkboard, shoved it in his truck, drove home, told himself it was an accident, told himself that for 7 days. I thought about the fifth step, the lateral scrape marks I'd noted that Sunday, gouged into old wood, the moss, a woman's shoe losing purchase, a body twisting against the railing, the physics of a fall that didn't have to happen if a man had simply let go. Patty stepped forward. Her voice was steady and formal and carried the full weight of a title most people in Briar Hollow forgot she held. Dale Morrow didn't resist. He didn't even stand up on his own. I watched Patty walk him out into the gray morning light, and I felt no triumph. None. Just the heavy, familiar grief of a case that turns, and the knowledge that turning it doesn't bring anyone back. 2 weeks had passed since Patty put the handcuffs on Dale Morrow in that office above the marine supply store. 15 days, and on a clear Saturday afternoon in mid-October, I found myself standing at the end of the harbor pier with my hands in my jacket pockets, watching the sun do something generous with the water. Dale's case was moving through county court. His attorney was arguing involuntary manslaughter. The prosecution saw it differently. They had Opal's letter, the camera footage, the timeline, the scrape marks on that fifth step. I'd given my statement twice, once to the county sheriff and once to the assistant district attorney, a woman half my age who took cleaner notes than I ever did. Whatever a jury decided, the facts were on the record now. That mattered. It didn't feel like enough, but it mattered. The letter and the map, the ones I'd found behind that painted closet door in Opal's back room, had been copied into evidence and the originals returned to Sylvie Chen. Turned out Opal had named her in a handwritten will tucked inside her desk drawer. Sylvie hadn't waited. She'd contacted the State Maritime Historical Society before the ink was dry on the custody release, and by the time I stood on that pier, a proper archaeological survey of the Amity Crest site was already taking shape. Divers, historians, grant applications. The whole careful machinery of legitimacy that Opal had spent years reaching for on her own. Her discovery would be handled right, not by her, but right. And then there was Harlan. I'll admit I carried a twist of guilt about Harlan Briggs. I'd watched him from across the street, studied his movements, questioned his grief, let suspicion harden around him like plaster. But Margaret's Inn records cleared him. He hadn't set foot in Briar Hollow until Thursday afternoon, the day after Opal died. When the truth about Dale came out, Harlan didn't rage, didn't posture. He just got very quiet for a long time. Then he told Sylvie he was keeping the diving bell open. Not as a shop, but as a maritime history museum dedicated to his aunt's memory. Sylvie would curate the collection. The brass bell above the door would stay where Opal had hung it, a grief-stricken man with an awkward way of showing it. That's all he ever was. The pier creaked under my boots. A gull cried out somewhere behind me. One sharp note that hung in the air, then dissolved. The harbor smelled the way it always did, diesel and brine, and now the faint sweetness of turning leaves drifting down from the wooded hills above town. I stood still and let the quiet press in close. I'd come to Briar Hollow looking for that quiet, a place to let the years settle around me. Read some books, learned to tolerate my own company for more than a few hours at a stretch. I was not looking for purpose, but purpose doesn't send an invitation. It comes from paying attention when something doesn't sound right. A bruise on a woman's wrist, a corkboard stripped bare overnight, a closet door painted shut that had no earthly business being painted shut. A town that thought it knew all its secrets still had one more hidden behind that door. I turned and started walking back toward town. The late afternoon light gilded the harbor at my back, laying long copper across the boats and the pilings and the storefronts along the waterfront. My shadow stretched out ahead of me on the weathered planks, long and thin, pointing toward whatever Briar Hollow was becoming for me. And I thought about the first time I walked into the Diving Bell. That narrow shop crammed floor to ceiling with maps and salvage relics and the smell of old wood and lamp oil. Opal standing behind the counter. This small, fierce, endlessly curious woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, pressing a cup of chamomile tea into my hands before I'd even finished telling her my name. She didn't know what she was handing me that afternoon. I didn't either. Just a warm cup and a few minutes of conversation with a stranger who listened like listening was a form of generosity. I know now, it wasn't quiet I found here. It was the obligation that comes after, when someone trusts you with a small kindness and you carry it forward because they no longer can. The sun was low. The air was cold. I kept walking toward town,